In this video, we will use your TI-84 to evaluate functions at various inputs. So suppose we have this function, f of x is x squared minus 9 divided by x plus 5. And we'd like to evaluate this function at various inputs. Now again, this is not difficult, so I'm sure you can evaluate this function at various inputs on your own. But again, this is for demonstration purposes, to show you some of the capabilities of your calculator. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is enter this function. And we do that just like we did if we wanted to graph this function using the y equals button. So let's put our function in. It is a rational function. X squared minus 9 is in the numerator, so we'll have to be careful with our parentheses. So parentheses x squared minus 9, close our parentheses, and then we are dividing by the quantity x plus 5, so don't forget your parentheses, x plus 5, and close the parentheses, enter. Now we do not want to graph this function, although we could, but we just want to evaluate at various inputs. So let's get out of the y equals window. We can do that with second quit. So we're back to the home screen. Suppose we want to evaluate this function at -5. Now, of course, we know that that does not exist, dne, because -5 is not in the domain of this function. But let's see how your calculator will handle that. So how do we recall this function? Now remember, we entered the function into y1. So that is the name of the function. Now on the screen here, we called the function f, but on our calculator, it's actually the function y1 of x. Okay? So how do we get to y1? Let's go back to the home screen. Well, y1 is a variable name for the function, so we do it under the vars button. So let's press the vars button. Now you'll notice at the top we have vars and yvars. Yvars is what we want because y is where the functions are stored. So we'll use the arrow key to move over to yvars. We want a function, so it's option 1. And the function we're looking for is y1, so we'll choose option 1. So that puts y1 on the screen. And now we'll use our function notation. So we parentheses, -5, close the parentheses. So that's just the usual function notation, and press enter. And of course, our calculator tells us, wait, you can't divide by 0. And that's exactly what we expected. Because when you try to input -5, you would be dividing by 0. -5 is not in the domain. Okay, so let's press enter to quit. Now suppose we wanted to find the value of this function y1 at 5. Now instead of going through the vars and the yvars again, don't forget we have some shortcuts. We can recall the last thing we typed in using entry. So let's use that. And remember, it's a raised key, so second entry. And that brings us back to y1 of -5. So we just use the arrows. We'll go back on top of the negative sign, and we'll just delete it. So we'll press del for delete. And now we have y1 of 5. Enter. 1.6. Now, of course, if we would like our answer as a fraction, let me remind you of an earlier video. Remember, you can convert 1.6 to a fraction. So we will recall the answer, second answer. And remember, the command is fraction, and it's under the math button. So math, and notice it's option 1 frac, and now we will press enter. 1.6 is really 8/5. And of course you can see that, right? F of 5 is 25 minus 9 over 10. So that is 16 over 10, or 8/5. Okay. So let's try something else. Let's evaluate this function at 25. Now again, we do not have to go through the vars and the y-vars. Remember, we can just recall the last thing we typed in. That's not what I wanted, right? That was the last thing we typed in, so let's do it again. Oh, that brings us back to the second last thing we typed in. Use the arrow buttons. Now, if I type a 2, it will just type over the 5. So I would like to insert a 2. So keep in mind there is an insert, which is a raised key. So second insert, and now I can type in a 2. And now my input will be y1 of 25. So my input is now 25, enter. 20.53333, and keep in mind whenever you see something like that, 3333, that should tip you off that there's a fraction involved, a fraction involving 3 in the denominator. So how about we recall our answer and find its fractional equivalent. Math frac, option 1. So 308 over 15. Now I said this was a fraction involving 3, and it has a 15. Well, keep in mind 15 is 3 times 5. Okay. So using the TI-84 to evaluate functions. Okay. Some nice shortcuts for you. Now you can also do this from the graph menu. In fact, if we go back and actually graph our function, so there is part of the graph of the function. It doesn't show everything, but there's part of the graph of the function. You can also evaluate functions from the graph, and that is under the calc menu that we've used before. Remember, we used calc to find intercepts. So you can also do that here, second calc. And it is option number 1, value. So if we use that, we can type in here at the cursor the value of x that we want for the input. So for example, we can type 5, enter, and it will tell us 1.6, just like before. So that is another way of evaluating a function, this time from the graph. So a shortcut that might be helpful for some of our problems, finding values of functions at various inputs.